Hello and welcome to the cockpit of a Boeing B-47 Stratojet, which was a high-altitude, high-speed strategic bomber used by the United States during the Cold War. Now, it introduced a whole range of new and interesting design features, and in this video I'm going to take you on a guided tour around it. First, we're going to crawl around the outside and I'll show you what's interesting, and then we're going to crawl back in here and I'll show you what it's like here in the cockpit. So let's get into it. I'm Paul Stewart and I make videos about planes. This includes reviews of flights from around the world and detailed tours through interesting aircraft and museums. If you're into these types of videos, then please check out my channel and subscribe. And a massive thanks to the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum near Omaha in Nebraska for letting me film inside this aircraft, the B-36 and the F-117. It's a brilliant museum and well worth a visit if you call yourself an av geek. Let's start with some history before we explore this incredible jet. In 1943, the United States Army Air Force, because remember, the USAF didn't come into being until 1947, informally requested a jet-powered reconnaissance bomber. Boeing initially planned to re-engine the B-29 with 4 jets, and here's a photo of the wind tunnel model, and the shape of the fuselage may be familiar. But wind tunnel testing identified that the engines produced far too much drag, so they moved them into the fuselage just behind the cockpit, calling it the Model 432. But discovered German research suggested that a swept wing improved speed, resulting in the Model 448, which had inboard engines and swept wings. It was felt that having the fuel and engine so close together in the fuselage was a fire hazard, so the 6 turbojets were moved to under-wing pods, resulting in the Model 450. This was further refined, but essentially this is what we see here, and the XB-47 first flew in December 1947. Under this panel here, we have the in-flight refueling receptacle, and this capability meant that it could fly much further yet didn't require the massive fuel tanks of its predecessor, the B-36. While jet engines were much faster and eventually more reliable, they were a lot thirstier, so they either had to use massive fuel tanks or in-flight refueling. This circular thing here is a Y4 horizontal periscopic bomb sight that the bombardier could use to bomb the targets visually or by using the radar. And above that is a warning antenna that could detect radar transmissions from any adversaries. This panel here is for the navigator-bombardier's ejection seat, which fired downward and ideally should not be used below 500 feet or 150 meters for obvious reasons. With advances in technology, this role was carried out by a single person. In fact, there were only 3 crew in total, with the other being the pilot and the co-pilot, the latter of whom operated the rear gun, and those 2 would be ejected upwards. This is in contrast with the B-36 that had at least 13 crew members to operate its many systems and guns. This black bulge is the radar system used for both the navigation and bombing. Directly behind it is an entrance hatch for the pilot and the co-pilot who sat in tandem in the bubble canopy that was great for visibility but also very hot. The tandem layout enabled thinner fuselages and cockpits, but it did inhibit communication between the pilots. The B-52 was initially designed to have a similar layout, as you can see with this photo of a prototype, but they changed it to have them sitting next to each other, as you can see in my footage in my B-52 video tour. This vent, labelled as cooling air inlet, takes in air that is used to cool the pressurised and very hot air bled from the starboard engines. The cockpit is pressurised, and they initially planned to have a man down in the tail gunner's position, but pressurising that was too complicated, so they gave that job to the co-pilot to shoot remotely. Now let's check out the rather unique looking landing gear. An especially large bombbay was needed to fit in the A-bomb, and prior to the B-47, they would mount the main landing gear under the wing as you see in the B-29. But in this case, the wings were far too thin and the engine nacelles were very small, so if they wanted to use a tricycle layout, they'd have to expand the fuselage laterally, making it much wider, like you see in a modern transport aircraft like this Boeing YC-14 from an upcoming video. In fact, here's one of the developmental models of this, and there's the flared lower fuselage and a large landing gear attached to the side. An alternative was to put the main gears in a tandem configuration similar to the later B-52 and then just fit small outrigger wheels under the engine pods. But because this layout made rotation more difficult, the aircraft sits at a nose-up angle ready for takeoff. powered by 6 General Electric J47 turbojets, creating around 7,600 pounds of thrust each depending on the variant. Of interest, they were attached via pylons rather than integrated into the wings like most aircraft of that era, and this allows for easier maintenance, replacement, and if there was a catastrophic failure, then they were less likely to severely damage the wing. But they would produce more drag than if they were integrated into the wing itself. As I mentioned earlier, the first designs had the engines mounted in the fuselage just behind the cockpit, but that was deemed too risky in an era where jet design was new and less reliable than it is now. Having said that, it was a fairly sturdy engine and also used on the F-86 Sabre, and 4 of them were used in the B-36. And this object here is an extra fuel tank. In fact, the wings were so thin as they prioritised minimising drag that they didn't store any fuel inside of them, so otherwise the fuel was all in the fuselage. And they were massive self-sealing tanks. In fact, it carried 17,000 gallons, which was over 3 times what the B-29 carried. Therefore, the copilot would have been busy managing the fuel trim to maintain a centre of gravity. Jets were faster and noisier than prop engines, but they did drink a lot of fuel, hence the need for extra tanks. To help boost the engine performance, they would spray water and methyl alcohol directly into the combustion chambers. You can see that line underneath and going into the chamber, and here's a view of the nozzle from the inside. This water increases the mass being forced out of the engine, thus increasing thrust. It also had the added advantage of cooling the turbines, allowing the engine to run at a higher RPM. But a negative is that it does partially quench the flame inside the chamber, resulting in the unburnt fuel spraying out behind and the black smoke that you can see. As these were very early jet engines, they were very slow in responding to throttle input. In fact, they would take up to 20 seconds from idle to full throttle, so when they were descending to land, they would keep the throttles at medium power just in case they needed to throttle up and go around. But to actually slow them while they were still in the air, they would open up a small drogue parachute, enabling them to actually land the aircraft. In fact, it was so aerodynamic that they would also lower the rear and outrigger landing gears, which doubles the aircraft's drag and help descend the aircraft. Once slower, the forward gear could be opened as well. Having said that though, the engines themselves weren't exactly that powerful, so when taking off with a full bomb load and fuel, they would need the assistance of 18 solid fuel JATO rockets, which stood for Jet Assisted Takeoff. They were installed into the fuselage around this position, and they would fire to help get the B-47 off the ground. In later models, such as this one, they actually attached 33 JATOs to a jettisonable split V or horse collar neck underneath, and they would be dropped shortly after takeoff to avoid carrying the unnecessary weight for the rest of the flight. We'll sneak in and look at the bombbay, which could carry 25,000 pounds of ordnances, including both conventional bombs and the Mark 36 thermo-nuclear bomb that you see here. This bomb was developed in the 1950s and could generate up to around 10,000 kilotons of TNT equivalent. For comparison's sake, the Hiroshima atomic bomb yielded just 15 kilotons, so 15 kilotons versus 10,000 of them from this bomb. That's impressive and also quite scary at the same time. This large white structure here is an additional fuel tank, as the bombbay would usually extend back towards the rear landing gear. This could carry around 12,000 litres or 3,300 US gallons of extra fuel. Here's a photo of the full-size bombbay, which obviously has less range, so it was a choice between a bigger bomb load versus a longer range. We'll work our way further aft and past these 3 circular antennas for the electronic countermeasure systems. The idea was that they, in conjunction with other systems, detect incoming hostile radar and/or missiles and send back confusing information. That might include a whole ton of radiation to overwhelm the hostile receiver, or incorrect information to trick it into thinking that the plane is elsewhere, or other tricks which remain classified. There was only one gun, and it was a twin 20mm M24A1 autocannon that was used remotely by the copilot. The reason for only one gun was that the performance was projected to be just as fast, or faster, and higher than any fighter jet, therefore they were only ever going to be attacked from behind. Above that are more electronic equipment, including radars. Now, I mentioned earlier one of the drag chutes used to slow the aircraft to descend and then land. This was because it was such a sleek design, and famous test pilot Chuck Yeager said that it was such a good design that it had trouble landing as it wouldn't want to descend. So the drogue parachutes would be required and would shoot out of this port side position. But there was another large one under here that would open once they actually landed, as reverse thrusting the engines wasn't commonplace, nor were aircraft brakes particularly advanced at the time. The next important part to mention is the wing, and I didn't film this brilliantly, so I've included some footage from the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona. This was the first American bomber to use swept wings, so contrast this with the straight wing B-45, which was America's first jet bomber. Because speed was a priority, they were also extremely thin, and that led to considerable flexibility. In fact, the wingtips could flex up to 17 foot or 5 meters. While it produced adequate high-speed lift, its low-speed lift was poor, resulting in high takeoff and landing speeds. This wasn't ideal, but the risk, well, for the bigwigs, was worth taking when most of the flight would be spent at a higher speed and altitude. Working our way forward again, and we move past those circular ECM antennas. And if you look closely, you'll see some of the hooks that the jettisonable JATO rocket horse collar would attach to. And then we come across this panel. Under here, the chaff is stored. It's made up of millions of aluminium coated glass fibers that can be released to confuse incoming Soviet missiles, who will hopefully hit that rather than the B-47. Here's a photo of an empty container, and this here is where it would be released through. Now we'll go past the port side of the bombbay, and by the way, if you want to see an even larger bomb, check out the Mark 17 42,000 pound or 19 ton bomb in my B-36 video. It dwarfs this one and was way too big for the B-47. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up so YouTube knows what types of videos you want to see more of. Now let's climb inside through the crew's entrance hatch. There's an internal ladder which folds out, meaning that you're not reliant on ground stairs, which I'm sure the B-58 crews would have appreciated, and it felt sturdy enough considering how many decades old it would have been. Immediately on my right is an access tunnel into the bombbay, and I'll mention that on the way down. But I'll keep walking, well, crawling, up, and ahead is the co-pilot's position. We'll crawl left and check out the navigator-bombardier positions first. As I said earlier, there's only 3 crew members as automation reduced the number required, and the less labour-intensive defences, such as a single gun, which was now heavily assisted by radar, means that there's just less work to do. I mean, the crew were busy, but it was manageable. These yellow objects are portable oxygen cylinders that would have been used if the pressurization fails. On the wall, there's a first aid kit within easy reach so that the crew could quickly treat themselves or a colleague if injured by a bullet or shrapnel from some Soviet hospitality. Down on the right was a toilet, which was a bucket where you would slide out and deposit your produce. Let's keep crawling through to the navigator-bombardier's position at the front. He's sitting on this downward firing ejection seat as I mentioned earlier. On the left are the controls to release the bombs, and straight ahead is the optical bomb sight that connects with the bulge that you might recall in the nose, which had a cover which itself slides up, revealing this. The white lever allows this guy to slightly adjust the aircraft's trajectory via the autopilot to ensure that the cross lines up with the target. Previous systems would have had a dial which the bombardier would use to take over the aircraft's direction. Here's his tiny window, which would have done very little other than letting in some light, and behind him were circuit breakers, controls for the lights, and cameras to check the accuracy of the bombing. Let's turn around and crawl back to the pilot in command seat. There was some equipment in it, such as a helmet, but it was still incredibly tight, so I can't imagine what it would have been like for the actual pilots many decades ago. I never got into the seat, but roughly here's the view that the pilot would have had, and it was pretty incredible looking back at those 6 engines along that sleek wing. It was also interesting seeing the B-58 Hustler on our starboard side, and I'll have to do that in a future video, well, once I work out how I'm going to climb up into one of them. Let's look around this interior, and under his right hand were 6 throttles, and these were duplicated with a direct linkage to the seat behind. Looking straight ahead, and it's very cool to see that yoke with B-47 on it. Unlike the B-36 cockpit, it's really cramped and not much room for the dials, but you can see the 6 dials across the 6 engines, showing RPM, and then below that is the fuel flow, and under that is the exhaust temperature. In front, there's the usual dials you'll see on any aircraft of this era. Whilst a tough plane to fly, at least there was hydraulic boost to help with the flight controls. Here's the rudder pedals, and interestingly on the ground, they also steered the forward landing gears, as you'll see that there's no tiller wheel elsewhere in the cockpit. Obviously the ratio of steering will be different when taxiing versus the very subtle input you'd want during a crosswind landing or takeoff, and there's a steering ratio lever here that adjusts this. It's like an 80-year-old manual version of the adaptive steering in your Ford Explorer. Moving back, and we'll have a look at the co-pilot seat. If you look at the base of the seat, you'll see that it's on a circular rail, and that's because he would sit in this position while flying, but if the enemy approached, he could spin the whole chair around and see the remote firing equipment. He had most of the controls from in front, although you can see here the fuel management controls, which would usually be managed by the flight engineer. Another negative of the tandem layout is the duplication, as opposed to both pilots sharing the same throttles if sitting side by side, for example. Communication would also be a challenge with the pilot sitting so far ahead. He also gets a great view of the wing and engines once again. Again, it was a real struggle getting out of the seat, and you get a view of the circular structure that the whole seat would rotate on while we sneak around the back. Now looking behind you, you can see the black handles, which were the emergency landing gear extension, and above that were the remote turret controls, which I'll show you a little bit more later. Remember that the original planned to have a second pressurized capsule at the rear of the plane for the gunner, but they decided to simply give that role to the co-pilot, saving the weight, complexity, and the need for another crew member. Here is an interesting display at the Marchfield Air Museum of a B-47 interior mock-up, used in the actual movie Strategic Air Command starring Jimmy Stewart. This provides a good view of the tandem layout of both pilot seats and how close they were to each other. You also get a good idea of the co-pilot seat that was able to rotate, and you can see the tail gun equipment, including the long black radar sight that they would turn around and look into. It really is an incredible sight and fascinating engineering. Now along that pathway on the port or left side of the 2 seats, and where I've been crawling, additional crew members could sit here during takeoff and landing, and there were seat belts attached to the floor. And this guy doesn't look too impressed with the levels of comfort. Here we are back in the first aircraft, and I'll crawl back and down the ladder, which you can see was quite a struggle, and I didn't think that I was that inflexible, but clearly I am. You'll shortly get a view of the unpressurized maintenance shelf into the bombbay, and once I'm out and on the ground, I'll walk over to the bombbay and look backwards so that you can see it's one continuous pathway. Of interest, here's an image of an RB-47H, which had a pressurized compartment in the bombbay, and this flew ELINT missions, which stood for Electronic Intelligence Missions. These would fly near Soviet airspace and capture information about the defensive radars. These had an additional 3 crew members who had downward firing ejection seats. They would strap themselves down to the floor in the cockpit because it would have been easier to escape from here during a crash landing or takeoff, but before 10,000 feet, they would crawl out to the pod. Remember that the downward ejection seats inside the pod was useless at a low altitude. In the end, just over 2,000 of these were built, and it remained as a strategic bomber until 1965, when it was replaced by the newer B-52, although it continued in a reconnaissance role until 1969. Really interestingly, they considered flying kamikaze, sort of, versions. Project Brass Ring explored flying remote control B-47s armed with hydrogen bombs to within 2 miles of the target, where they would be destroyed by the detonation. There were uncertainties about how to deliver a weapon with such a huge explosion, so this was considered but eventually cancelled. B-47 did go on to be used as a target drone. In fact, 14 were converted to QB-47E drones, and all but 2 were destroyed during testing. Another weapons delivery technique was called bomb lofting, where the aircraft pulls up before releasing, starting the weapon on an upward vector, giving it additional flight time for the plane to escape. The plane also avoids flying over the target, which might be heavily defended. The plane itself would flip over backwards and then fly off at speed. Now, it made for some incredible footage as you see here, but put the airframe under considerable strain. There was a WB-47B used in a weather reconnaissance role. Now, before satellites, these were important, especially when planning missions. For example, there was a weather recon version of the B-50 Superfortress, providing important forecasts when planning reconnaissance flights over Cuba during the missile crisis. There was the EB-47E, which was an electronic warfare version with 13 crew known as crows or ravens, positioned in a pod in the bombbay, similar to what I mentioned before. It also had extra antennas and chaff dispensers, and their role was to jam enemy radars. And finally, the only model to see combat was the reconnaissance RB-47E, of which 240 were built, and the nose was stretched by 34 inches, or just under 1 meter, to allow for additional cameras and radar to be positioned in there. You'll notice that the antenna and bombing sight of the other models has been removed. The fuel capacity was also increased to provide added range to the USSR. In 1960, one was shot down by a MiG-19 above international waters off the Arctic coast of the USSR. 4 crew were killed and 2 were captured before being returned to the USA eventually. They even stuck an F-111's nose on one of these to test the new radar system, so it was an incredibly versatile design. Its final flight was in 1977. While it's less famous than other bombers, the introduction of the swept-wing design and having engines in pods revolutionized aircraft design, and this has continued to this day in both military and civilian large aircraft. The landing gear was also novel. Boeing test pilot Tex Johnson said that it was one of the most significant airplanes in the world, and I'd have to agree. While it did never drop a bomb in anger, the lessons learned went into the development of other aircraft, including the highly successful B-52 and 707 airliner. I also think that it was one of the most striking looking bombers of the era as well. If you enjoyed the video, then please give it a thumbs up and comment below if you've been to the Strategic Air Command Museum in Nebraska, or let me know if you're about to visit after seeing this video. Please check out my B-36 guided tour video, which includes going inside the 80-meter communication tunnel, and there's plenty of other videos in my channel as well. Thanks for watching.